are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. This is Corbin Smith, your host for Locked On Seahawks. Joining me for our Wednesday episode, as always, my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. We've got an August John Schneider special coming our way. We're going to be breaking down Seattle's first trade here in the month of August, heading towards the 2021 season. We'll be analyzing that trade for cornerback John Reid, and of course the return of Techno Thursdays with Luke Wilson re-signing for the fourth time, rejoining the Seahawks. A jam-packed episode, a lot to talk about. It was a very newsy day at the VMAC yesterday for the Seahawks. The NFL season's about to begin, and nobody covers it like the Locked On Podcast Network. August 30th through September 8th, Locked On's Ultimate Season Preview is taking you through every team and every division with the help of Odyssey's lineup of NFL experts. Follow the Ultimate Season Preview 2021 feed on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcast to tune in beginning August 30th. Now for your lead story here on Locked On Seahawks, a lot of good injury news for the Seahawks on Tuesday as they return to practice. 8 different players returning to the field after extended absences. Headlining that group, the Seahawks no longer have a player on the PUP list. Running back Travis Homer was activated and was limited in practice yesterday. So good news for Seattle's backfield, good news for Homer because this is a crowded group, and so he's going to get an opportunity. Maybe we'll see if he plays this weekend. Might be hard-pressed just returning to practice on Tuesday, but they're going to have him ready to go for the regular season, and that makes that group even more interesting as we head towards cutdown day.
No, absolutely does. I think that for a guy like Travis Homer, he might have been injured, but he has not gone blind. And I think that he's seen the types of plays that DJ Dallas has been making, and been reading about the way that, maybe Alex Collins or the undrafted free agent Josh Johnson is performing. Rashad Penny coming back from the ACL in the best shape of his life. So, yeah, I think that Travis Homer is big-time news. I still believe that he is probably Seattle's best pass blocking running back. So I think that is big news. As you mentioned, there were 7 other players who returned to the field for the Seahawks yesterday. And I think that it's critical to mention the offensive linemen, Cedric Ogbuehi and Jamarco Jones. Same thing with Travis Homer, kind of hearing about the competition. I think that Ogbuehi and Jones are getting back onto the field because they recognize that they have to, because there are other players out there, Jake Curran being one of them, that, it definitely has been impressing people. Also, Ethan Posick, Geno Smith, back at quarterback, critical, for Seattle. DJ Reid, Marquise Blair, linebacker John Radican, the tight end Tyler Avery. It was, a huge rush of Seahawks returning to the field for practice, of course, with the final preseason game here coming up this weekend and the NFL opener for the Seahawks just a couple of weeks away on September 12th against the Colts. So this was a big deal, Corbin. And so I'm happy that we're kind of breaking down some of the players that returned to the field. I think you're going to see Seattle's easily most successful performance this weekend against the Chargers, based a lot on the return of health of Seattle starters.
And Pete Carroll talked about this after Saturday's loss to the Broncos, that they were going to be changing things up a little bit. Basically, they went into regular season mode. So I expected a number of players to be back on the practice field. I don't know that I expected this many to return on their Tuesday practice, but clearly they were holding some guys back. Penny Hart is another player that practiced yesterday as well that I forgot to add to our list. That's how many guys returned yesterday. It was easy to forget about certain players not being back on the field, but Penny Hart missed the last 2 weeks with a sprained ankle. He looked really good at practice yesterday. He was moving well on that ankle. So that's good news for Seattle's receiving core heading into this game as well. I think he's got a chance to get some snaps for the Seahawks against the Chargers. So getting all these players back, as you mentioned, the offensive line, that might be the biggest deal to me in terms of roster competition, because I really think this is the Jake Curran effect. Curran has played so well in the first 2 preseason games at right tackle that Jamarco Jones and Cedric Ogbuehi were probably thinking, you know what, I better get back on the field and reprove myself because this undrafted rookie is gunning for my job. And then in the secondary, we'll talk about the second quarter. The Seahawks made some significant changes at the cornerback group yesterday with waiving a player and making a trade. But getting DJ Reid back on the field is a big deal because he was really looking good the first couple weeks of camp. I still believe he is your starter at right cornerback, and the comments that Pete Carroll made after practice yesterday reaffirmed that belief from me. I think that he is the guy that Pete Carroll wants to win that job. Now being back healthy, he's got a chance to really secure that position away from Trey Flowers. We'll see if he gets snaps on Saturday night. And Marquise Blair being back because of his injury history, just seeing him on the field is a big deal. And he's still in a competition there with Ugo Amadi. That one I think is up in the air right now because Amadi has played well. He's looked good in the preseason games. We saw what he did last year. And Blair has not proven he can be available. So that one to me is a 50-50 proposition. What those two are going to be looking like in week one. Who's the starter? Who's only getting a handful of snaps in the slot? Marquise Blair is going to get some work at safety as well, hopefully in this upcoming preseason game. So the Seahawks are much healthier than what they have been. There were a few negative injury updates yesterday. Tre Brown, the rookie corner out of Oklahoma, with DJ Reid coming back. You add a player back, and now Tre Brown is sidelined. Who knows how long? Pete Carroll said day-to-day with a sore knee. We'll see how long he's out, but he did not practice on Tuesday. And the trade we'll be talking about here in a moment makes me wonder if maybe that injury is a little more significant than what he was letting on yesterday. And Colby Parkinson's still working back from a slight fracture in his foot. Parkinson is optimistic he's going to play in week one, but Pete Carroll's still not going to commit to that. They don't know when he is going to be returning. So not necessarily bad news, but at the same time, didn't get great news on him either, that Parkinson is on the verge of returning. So that is going to be a storyline that we will be watching closely over the next few weeks heading into the regular season. When we return in the second quarter, I've been mentioning this trade throughout the show so far. John Reid coming to the Seahawks, adding a little bit of depth at cornerback. Rob and I will be breaking down John Schneider's first trade of the 2021 season. We might see a few more this August, given how much John Schneider likes to flip players around on the roster. But we'll be breaking down this trade and what it means for the Seahawks secondary when we return. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's that time of year again, and all eyes are now turning to football as teams are back on the gridiron to start the NFL and college football season. As always, BetOnline is your number one spot for all the pro and college football action this season. Get all the updated odds, props, contests, including online's biggest $500,000 NFL mega contest and the world's largest $200,000 NFL Survivor contest open now at BetOnline. Head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today to receive your 100% welcome bonus. Be sure to take advantage of their opening day super promo. Make a bet on Thursday, September 9th, the season opener between the Buccaneers and the Cowboys. And if you lose, your wager will be refunded up to $25 for new customers only when signing up and using the promo code NFL100. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite sports, from football, basketball, boxing, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait. Take advantage of all the great offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Wednesday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith, joined as always by Rob Rang. John Schneider is not a stranger when it comes to making trades in August. Now, last year was a different animal with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that with quarantining players and all the things that were going on, the protocols, trying to trade for a player was extremely difficult to do at that stage of the season. But in the past, John Schneider has loved to make trades in the middle or towards the end of training camp to try to bolster the roster. We've seen players like Justin Coleman and Jacob Hollister come over from the Patriots. We saw Brett Hundley come over from the Packers to try to upgrade the backup quarterback position. John Schneider likes to make deals this time of year, and he made his first trade of August 2021 yesterday, bringing in cornerback John Reid from the Houston Texans in exchange for a conditional 7th-round pick. Now, this looks very much like a trade that Schneider made around the same time 2 years ago with the New York Jets. He sent a conditional 7th-round pick to the Jets for Perry Nickerson, a young cornerback. Nickerson was only on the team for about a week and a half, and then they waived him, so they didn't have to forfeit that draft pick. This looks like a very similar trade in the sense that I think Reid is far from a lock to make this team. In fact, I would be somewhat surprised if he ends up making this team. If Tre Brown's injury is more significant than being out a few days, then maybe he's got a chance. But this really looks to me, Rob, like a true flyer on a player that was a fourth-round pick only a year ago, was a standout at Penn State, has good athletic tools, but quite frankly underwhelmed for the Texans when given opportunities last year and really struggled in training camp this year.
Well, he did struggle in training camp this year. Of course, I wasn't there in Houston to watch that, but that's the reports. But I think that it's understandable when you consider that that John Reid was drafted by his former college coach, Bill O'Brien, who was the head coach and general manager of the Houston Texans until this past season when he was fired and been replaced by a new general manager and Nick Caserio, a new head coach and David Culley, who's got an offensive background, had previously been with the Baltimore Ravens. The defensive coordinator there now in Houston is, one of the great coaches in my opinion, that we've seen in quite some time, but not necessarily a great head coach, and that being Lovie Smith. And of course, people remember when he took the Chicago Bears to the Super Bowl. And so he certainly has a track record behind him. And then, of course, he's been at the University of Illinois for a long time since that time. But he's also a guy who was always kind of focused in on cover two zone type of corners. And there's no doubt about it. John Reid is a little bit undersized for that. Frankly, he's a little bit undersized for what the Seahawks have prioritized in the past, Corbin. I think it's kind of goes back to what we discussed about in our first episode or our first segment there with the return to the field of DJ Reed and how important that is. And I really think that when you look at excuse me, at John Reid, whose last name is spelled differently, R-E-I-D, rather than DJ Reed, R-E-E-D, so clearly not related in any way. But they are related in terms of their size, their physical nature with which they play, the ball skills which they demonstrated. John Reid was a three-time all-conference player at Penn State. Seattle's current special teams coach, Tracy Smith, or assistant special teams coach, I should say, Tracy Smith, who Pete Carroll referred to when during the press conference yesterday talking about the addition of John Reid. Tracy Smith had been in Houston the last 3 years, so he is seeing what John Reid is like in the building, just in terms of his competitiveness and things like that. Clearly, the Seahawks had higher than a 7th round grade on John Reid, and that's why they felt comfortable making that move. As you mentioned, it is it's a deal that basically is incumbent on Reid making the roster for that trade really to go through and for the Houston Texans to get that 2023 7th round pick for Reid. And again, him being a 4th round pick with athletic ability, straight line speed, a verified 4.4 guy. I think that it makes some sense considering all the issues that you have at the cornerback position. And then finally, one last note on Tre Brown. I thought it was interesting, just kind of the way, the body language, the way that Pete Carroll kind of chose his words so carefully when discussing Seattle's rookie Tre Brown. There was an initial question that was asked about Tre Brown's stats, and Carroll's quote was, "He's got a sore knee. We're kind of going day to day right now," which doesn't give you much, of an idea of what's going to happen. And I think when you look down a little bit later, though, when they start asking about Tre Brown, John Reid being traded in or added to the group in the cornerback position, then Carroll basically says right off the bat that that the fact that Tre Brown, again, this is a direct quote, his opening quote about the cornerback position. Well, the fact that Tre Brown is down right now is why John Reid is coming in. So very much a cause and effect relationship with John Reid. And that's why I think that there is a possibility, Corbin, that John Reid does in fact make this roster. I think it's going to be fascinating to see the way this evaluation goes.
Yeah, that was, you mentioned the body language. That was something that kind of struck me a little bit being at the press conference yesterday, because Pete Carroll, he's very good at coach speak. He really knows how to, especially with injuries, he knows how to downplay things and not provide too many details. He's done this for a long time. But sometimes you can just tell by his body language, it looked like he was uncomfortable when he was asked about Tre Brown's situation. And it might just be a sore knee. He's only out a couple days. Maybe it really is a day-to-day proposition. But just the fact that they quickly, rather than trying to wait for Reid to get released, because everything I've been told talking to people that cover the Texans is John Reid was going to be released in the very near future. Rather than risk somebody else claiming him off waivers and not being able to get him, they said, you know what, we'll send a conditional 7th-round pick, because if it works out, he'll be well worth a 7th-round selection. So the fact that they did that, though, so promptly tells me that maybe Tre Brown's injury is a little more significant. I'm not saying it's severe. I'm not saying this is something he's going to be out for the season or whatever, but it could be a multi-week injury, and the regular season is less than 3 weeks away. So the Seahawks feel like they need depth, and Brown was a player that was starting to emerge at the cornerback spot. And so if he is out for multiple weeks, that does open the door for John Reid to carve out a role in this rotation, especially if he plays well in special teams, and that's been a strength for him in his game. And so I think it's a fascinating development. I can see a lot of parallels with Perry Nickerson, that trade, and I could see him being released in quick order, and then they don't have to give the 7th-round pick. And then a player like Reid, now you're at a crossroads. You've been with 2 teams now in 2 years, and who knows what your next opportunity is going to be. But as you mentioned, this is a player that has the physical tools. He doesn't have the length and the size Seattle has wanted in the past, but true 4.4 speed. He ran a 6.95 second 3-cone, so he also has pretty good quickness. He had 20 bench press reps, which, believe it or not, that is something the Seahawks have prioritized at the cornerback position. They like guys that can put up 10-plus bench press reps, and that helps with press coverage. And so this is a kid that checks off a number of those boxes. He's a competitor. He's got a high football IQ, and we know Pete Carroll's reputation for developing defensive backs. So I'm not going to judge this trade right now based on the fact that Reid struggled last year and quarterbacks posted a 142.9 passer rating when targeting him. He only was targeted 10 times. He only played 145 defensive snaps. That's a very small sample size. So I'm not going to judge this trade here and be like, oh, you just brought in a guy that's been terrible in the NFL. He's only been in the league for a year. Let Pete Carroll have a chance to coach him up. Andre Curtis, let him have a chance to coach this kid up. And we'll see what happens. This is truly taking a flyer on a player. And if it works out, giving up a 7th-round pick isn't going to be a big deal. If it doesn't, you can cut him in a week and a half and you can get your 7th-round pick back and you draw even. So this is the type of trade that John Schneider likes to make in August. He's done it in the past several times with conditional picks. And so we'll see what happens here. But certainly Tre Brown's status, I think, has a lot to do with whether or not John Reid has a chance to make this team.
I agree with you. And again, I think that it's important to know, as we've talked about, Corbin, that this is something that John Schneider has done many, many times. And of course, I certainly believe that he is among the best general managers in all of the NFL. And Nick Caserio for Houston in his first year as a general manager, he may also wind up becoming one of the best general managers in the NFL. But I think it makes all the sense in the world from a competitive standpoint to be having conversations with some of these relatively new talent evaluators to see if they do make a mistake, if they are willing to trade a player away that, perhaps you have a higher grade on. And then going back again to Houston Texans and just trying to understand why a player might be released after just a year with the team. You have to understand the Houston Texans last year, Corbin, again, they completely wiped out their coaching staff, their front office staff. And part of the reason why was because of just how horrific their defense was a season ago. They were dead last in turnovers created, only had a combined three interceptions all season long. Now, you might make the argument that, well, maybe John Reid should have been playing more if he is good enough to warrant a trade if the Houston Texans secondary was that bad. But think about it. They lost the pass rushers like a Jadeveon Clowney, like a J.J. Watt. They had some talent in Houston, but they also had all kinds of injuries on the offensive side of the ball as well. So to me, last year for the Houston Texans was basically a wash. And so I like the way you described it as being a flyer select or a flyer trade, for the Seahawks with John Reid. But I think it also is one that has basically no cost, or essentially a small cost, with a late 7th-round pick, hopefully in 2023, for a guy who has all kinds of upside. And obviously at a position of concern for the Seahawks, to me, this is one of those types of no-brainer type of trades that you see veteran general managers make in the NFL year in and year out. John Schneider doing that as well as anybody.
And I'll just say this, if it's a different situation than Nickerson 2 years ago and Reid does end up making the roster, at least is on the roster the first few weeks of the season, this is a player that you have under club control through 2023 at an affordable rookie contract, and he's only 25 years old. So those are the type of gambles that you roll the dice on, and you're willing to give up a conditional 7th-round pick for because you believe there's upside. You believe there's a lot of potential. And this is a guy, as you mentioned, that was a 3-time All Big Ten selection at Penn State. So he has that pedigree. He's a really solid football player. It just didn't work out for him in Houston. Maybe a change of scenery can help him turn his career around. And where better to go than Seattle, where you have Pete Carroll and a really good coaching staff that knows what they're doing, working with defensive backs. We'll see what happens. When we come back in the third quarter, we're going to scan the waiver wire. A lot of teams cutting players as they get down to 80 players. And normally that would mean you're probably not going to be looking at players that are cut this early. But there are some intriguing players that are now on the waiver wire that the Seahawks might want to take a look at. Rob and I are going to check out a couple players apiece that might make sense for the Seahawks to claim off waivers or re-sign as free agents. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Did you know that Built Bar has so many delicious flavors? There is something for everyone. When you talk to a Built Bar fan like myself, we're definitely passionate about our favorite flavors. And if you don't know some of the Built Bar flavors out there, well, you're missing out. Coconut, raspberry, double chocolate, one of my personal favorites, salted caramel, as well as cookies and cream. Tons of delicious flavors. If you haven't tried all the flavors, you can get a mixed box where you'll get 2 of each of the 9 flavors. I usually order 2 or 3 sets of them at once because I've got to have a Built Bar before I lift weights or go for a long run. Regardless of my workout, it is my pre-workout snack of choice. Not only are Built Bar flavors the best tasting, but they're healthy too. 17 to 18 grams of protein, calories ranging from 130 to 180, only 4 to 5 grams of sugar, and only 4 to 5 grams of net carbs. So you get amazing flavors, all tasty, and all healthy. Order today and get the grasshopper cookie or raspberry or whatever you like. Go to Built.com and use promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order at Built.com. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Joining me for our Wednesday episode, my co-host, Rob Rang. As we just highlighted in the second quarter, the Seahawks made a significant move on Tuesday, trading for cornerback John Reid. He's replacing Pierre Desir, who was waived yesterday. Not really a big surprise, given the fact that Desir hadn't done much in the 2 preseason games, and he'd kind of fallen down the depth chart a little bit. But shaking up the secondary, and we know John Schneider is as good as any general manager in football at churning the roster during training camp and during the preseason. And even after they get their initial 53-man roster, typically they are not done making moves, and that roster gets some changes before they take the field in week 1 for their season opener. So keeping that in mind, normally this time of year when teams are cutting down from 90 players to 80, if you're one of the first 10 players that gets cut, that is not a good omen for you because every other team is trying to trim their rosters as well. So the chances of latching on somewhere else and not getting cut again in a week or week and a half are pretty slim. That being said, you and I were scanning the waiver wire, guys that have been released by other teams, and there were a few young players at position of need for the Seahawks that you and I both agreed might make a lot of sense to at least bring in for the next week and see what they can do at their respective positions. And most notably, you and I noticed that there were a number of centers that were intriguing that have been waived over the past few days.
Yeah, that's the thing. When I heard that Seattle had made a trade with the Houston Texans, I was not thinking it was going to be the cornerback John Reid. I thought it would be another player that the Texans actually did release in the rookie, but a 4-year starter at Kentucky, center Drake Jackson. Now, you know, the longtime LockedOnSeahawks.com listeners, Corbin, might remember that I talked a lot about Drake Jackson and just how excited I was about this year's center class. Unfortunately, we've talked a lot also about how much Seattle's current centers, whether it be the off and on injured Ethan Posick, whether it be Kyle Fuller, whether it be the, kind of encouraging play that we've seen from Brad Lemblade. But still, center is obviously a position of concern. And, when I remember watching Drake Jackson at Kentucky, this is a sawed-off guy. This is a guy who's 6'1.5". He's 290 pounds. You look at him, he looks a little bit like Joey Hunt. At the same time, I think that there would be some Seahawks fans right now who might be comforted having a player like a Joey Hunt on your roster, considering how much inconsistency Seattle has had at the center position as well. Drake Jackson was the quickest center I saw off the ball all year long last year. And when I think of guys like Aaron Donald, it's the quickness, it's the power that he demonstrates first. I think that Drake Jackson is a terrific fit for a team that has a zone blocking scheme. At the same time, I also think that there is a really intriguing center, another former SEC standout, in Lamont Gilliard, who was released from the Cincinnati Bengals here just recently after previously being a 6th-round draft pick of the Arizona Cardinals. He does have legitimate NFL experience, played in 13 games, started 2 games for the Arizona Cardinals after being a 6th-round pick back in 2019. He is more of a power player. He's 6'3", 320 pounds. To me, he kind of fits in a little bit more with what Mike Solari has traditionally looked to do. Drake Jackson fitting a little bit more with what I think that Shane Waldron and Andy Dickerson, the run game coordinator, obviously brought from the Rams along with Waldron, what they have traditionally looked to do. So either way, Corbin, I think there's 2 good quality young centers who are out there that might be worth the Seahawks putting in a waiver claim just to kind of kick the tires and see if they might be able to improve the center rotation.
And I'm going to throw my own name into the hat, another rookie that was with the Philadelphia Eagles until a couple of days ago when he was waived from the University of Indiana, Harry Kreider. And he's more in the Drake Jackson mold in the sense that he's not a mauler. This is not a guy that is going to win by imposing his will at the line of scrimmage. I actually see some parallels in his game to Ethan Posick in that regard. He's better suited to win in a zone blocking scheme, but he's really a pass protecting center. And that's what stood out to me when I watched Indiana's game film going into the pre-draft process. And Kreider was a guy that I had a 6th, 7th round, maybe undrafted grade on. I did not anticipate he was going to get picked any earlier than that because, again, I don't think he is a great run blocker. He's not a guy that's going to impose his will on opponents, but he's known for his pass protection skills. He's good at mirroring defenders. And he was in Philadelphia. They had a lot of depth there. He's still there. They made the move to draft Landon Dickerson out of Alabama, and he's going to be back soon. So there were plenty of bodies in front of him. But I think Kreider would be an interesting player too. And I keep using this word today, but take a flyer on this kid because he is a rookie. He's a young guy that maybe could develop into a quality NFL center. It didn't work out in Philadelphia, but with the depth concerns that Seattle has at the center position, I think Kreider would be a fascinating project for them to take on, and maybe ends up being a practice squad guy his first year. But I think the upside is there for him to play some snaps at the center position in the NFL with proper development. I think Mike Solari would be the right coach to bring that out of him.
I think that he would. Kreider is another one that really, to me, is intriguing of the young interior offensive lineman. And I think that it bears repeating, Corbin, you said it in the opening of this segment that, obviously if you are among the first players cut, then typically that suggests that you're not one of the best players. And so usually these players don't get re-signed, but when you're talking about really young players, or sometimes NFL teams kind of do veterans a solid by releasing them early so that they do have some time to negotiate. I think in the case, and I'm specifically going to talk about Drake Jackson just for a moment, again, just because of the size, the fact that he does have the short arms that he has, I think is one of the concerns that people have about him. He's 31 1/8-inch arms at 6'2", 293 pounds. That is something that just simply is not going to be allowable by a lot of NFL teams. He was initially in Detroit, and before that he was released by Houston. And those are 2 teams that also have had, again, a lot of transition, a lot of turnover, not just along the offensive lines, but along the coaching staff, along the scouting staff. And so take advantage of that situation. I believe firmly that Drake Jackson can play in the NFL. As I mentioned before, 4-year starter at Kentucky. I watched him in person at the Senior Bowl. Terrific player. And so again, his quickness, his underrated power, his savvy, I think that he screams one of those kind of guys that you kick the tires on, but he's not the only ones. I definitely want us to kind of highlight some other players that are out there. I know there's a lot of Locked On Seahawks fans out there who, don't pay as much attention to the line of scrimmage. They look for skill position players. And I certainly understand that. So one that I wanted to mention is another relatively young player that a lot of Seahawks fans were really excited about when he was coming out of Iowa State a couple of years ago, played the wide receiver position at Iowa State, but Hakeem Butler was moved to tight end in Philadelphia. And whether it be at wide receiver or at tight end, Hakeem Butler's size and ball skills, his body control, I think would be intriguing. 6'5", 220 pounds roughly, and running in the 4.5s, 4.6s. It's not straight line speed, but that Pete Carroll has always loved having those big wide receivers, and there's not a lot of them on Seattle's roster behind DK Metcalf, Travis Toivonen, and being one of them, but it might be another player that Seattle is interested in.
Butler was one of my favorite prospects in that draft class coming out of Iowa State, and it just has not worked out for him in the NFL. Was never able to get things rolling in Arizona, couldn't get in their rotation. He missed his entire rookie season injured, and so he's just been unable to latch on anywhere. The Eagles had him on their practice squad for a while. They tried to move him to tight end. He's still a player that I think in the right situation might be able to contribute for you, but it just hasn't, at this point, it hasn't worked out. I don't know what you're going to get out of him being a player that clearly hasn't been able to make that transition to tight end. And there's questions about speed at the receiver position in the NFL. So he's a guy that it just hasn't worked out. There's been a number of big receivers in that draft class. We've seen what's happened with N'Keal Harry in New England. Really, DK Metcalf has been the outlier there with the success that he's had in Seattle. The other bigger receivers in that class have not performed well. Maybe in the right situation, and maybe Seattle would be that right situation, Butler could thrive, and he's certainly got a lot of physical tools that would be intriguing, so he'd be worth a flyer. The last guy that I want to mention, I think with Ben Burke-Irvin going down, and Pete Carroll mentioned it yesterday, the emergence of Nick Bellore, the reemergence of Nick Bellore playing linebacker. The Seahawks are feeling pretty comfortable with their linebacker depth because they believe he could play for them on Sundays. I mean, he started 10 games for the 49ers in 2016, so it's not far-fetched to believe that he could jump into the lineup and play snaps for you on defense. And I thought he looked great at linebacker the other night in the preseason game. And so I understand why Pete Carroll is comfortable with that, but I still think adding another linebacker to the mix, especially one that can really add value on special teams to compensate for the loss of Ben Burke-Irvin, I think that is something that would be a big deal for the Seahawks here these next couple of weeks. Get a linebacker in that can move, can play special teams, has youth on his side. And so Josh Watson, who played for the Broncos, he actually, I believe, played some snaps for them in Saturday's preseason game. He played in 17 games for the Broncos the last 2 seasons, had 9 tackles on special teams, played over 300 snaps on special teams, come out of Colorado State, has good size, 6'2", 240 pounds. He ran a 7.09 second 3-cone drill, so he's got pretty good quickness for his size. 4.7 speed, so not a blazer in that regard, but he's got good quickness, 36.5-inch vertical too. So you're talking about a guy that's got some athletic traits. He has special teams experience. That type of player, it'd be nice to bring in, especially with the youth that you have with Watson being only 25 years old. Maybe still a guy that's got a little higher ceiling if you can develop him, and most certainly can help you on special teams. Those are the type of players that you are going to claim off waivers. You're going to sign after they clear waivers and bring in that got cut this early in the process. And there's only a handful of them that are going to qualify for that. Most of the players that have been cut, they probably aren't going to get another opportunity. But players like Watson, I could see being good fits for the Seahawks, at least to take a look at them and see if they fit into the puzzle before week 1.
I agree. I think that adding another kind of run and hit linebacker that, again, can play that role that BBK played on special teams, as well as just having the instincts and the straight line speed. He's a 4.4 guy himself. There's not a lot of those guys, and usually those that are available, usually have size limitations or things like that. As I mentioned before, with the center Drake Jackson, another linebacker who kind of fits that mold. But unfortunately, when he was released by the Colts, he was done so with the injury designation, so not likely to be somebody that would fit in, but still is a big name that has some really good football in his resume resume that might be worth checking out would be Sky Moore from the Colts. And obviously, with the Colts being Seattle's week 1 regular season opener, then he might be able to provide some type of intel if that was to work out. But it's pretty, I feel like at the center position, at some of the skill positions, there are some talent available. Linebacker, unfortunately, is not one of the areas that I see a lot of players who I think are necessarily be able to come in and actually be able to help the Seahawks that much. Watson and Moore being two of the ones that do intrigue me.
Betting on the NFL doesn't have to be a guessing game if you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling. Get daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favored picks, and Lee Sterling's lock of the day. Follow Locked On Bets podcast brought to you by betonline.ag wherever you get podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Check out Locked On Seahawks on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. That's AUDACY. Coming up on our Thursday episode, I'll be joined by Nick Lee, and the two of us will be conducting our latest bubble watch as we look at which players are on the 53-man roster and which players aren't on the 53-man roster heading into the preseason finale. Thanks for listening in. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.